This episode is brought to you by Bleacher Report. How do you follow sports? From college football to the NBA, Bleacher Report brings you the latest news, live scores, and epic highlights from your favorite leagues, teams, and athletes, all in one app. Dive into exclusive shows hosted by your favorite athletes and original Bleacher Report series with breaking news, rumors, and predictions all season long. Download Bleacher Report to personalize your coverage.
This is Hear Her Sports, the female athlete podcast for everyone who loves stories by and about women. I'm your host, Elizabeth Emery. In each episode, I introduce a female athlete or a woman in the business of sport through a thoughtful conversation about who they are and all the terrific work they're doing. My guests and I get into what their sport is all about and what it's like being a female athlete today. Joining me in this episode is Katie Holmes, a runner and a writer. Katie is currently researching and writing a book on women's running history with a focus on women who break the rules. Katie is also interested in and researches older women runners like herself. You can read more about running as an older woman on her blog, Run Young 50. Today, she and I talk about her own training, where she discovered her competitive side, fell racing, being an older athlete, what she's discovering by talking to a bunch of older, fast British female runners who make their mark in running history, the importance, and I also suppose the purpose of history, and of course, the book that she's working on. Many of the women Katie has been interviewing broke rules in the UK by jumping into men's races before women were allowed to compete officially. We both marvel that those days were not that long ago. As a bit of a marker, she and I were alive when these women were being bold and brave and running long distances when few women were, and many men said they couldn't and shouldn't. Because of the restrictions and lack of racing opportunities for these women, Katie said, we'll never know what they might have been able to achieve. I'm so pleased Katie agreed to join me before her book was finished, and I hope to get her back on when it is done. Let's welcome Katie Holmes. Hi, Katie. This is so wonderful that you're here. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to talk about your work and your own running.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be on Hear Her Sports.
Wonderful. Well, first off, you are a runner yourself, and in our offline discussion, you mentioned that you're racing tomorrow. What's going on?
I was about to do my first cross-country race for quite a long time. That was a few weeks ago, but it went really well, so I was pleased. I've been wanting to get back into cross-country and into racing generally. I've had a hamstring problem which has been coming and going for quite a long time, so it was nice to be out there again.
How was it?
It was fine. I was very far down the field, but I didn't really mind because I was just happy to be outside, and it was quite a short course, only about just over 3 miles, so it wasn't too demanding.
Right. How do you approach your racing? I mean, you mentioned that you were far down in the field. I mean, is that important when you're not dealing with an injury or something like that, or do you just go out and see what you can do?
It really varies. When I've been racing, I've often had targets in mind, times that I wanted to do, and that's usually, I've usually got some kind of goal. It might not be in that particular race, but I might be using a race as sort of preparation for trying to do a particular time.
And you race quite a bit, actually, right? Did I read that right somewhere?
I have done. I mean, I haven't really been racing that much because I stopped racing in June 2022. But prior to that, I'd be doing cross country during the winter. So maybe do 7 cross country races during the winter season, and then race track during the summer. So I'd be doing I don't know, maybe going to about 8 track meetings over the summer, and then doing some road racing as well. And in the past, I've done things like I set myself a challenge of running a half marathon every month and things like that.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, that's one thing that's so nice about running is that there are always events or races to do and, in so many different distances. And you mentioned cross country and the track and yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that variety. And I mean, I'm late to start running. I started running at 47 and I'd never done cross country or track racing. So it's wonderful, or fell racing actually. So it's wonderful to get the chance to do these things.
Fell racing is very British. What actually is that?
It's open countryside. And I have to say I'm a complete novice. I've only actually done one fell race, but they're varying lengths of races. So often they're quite short, like maybe 3 miles, 4 miles, but they can be something like up to 18 miles. And the difficulty of the terrain can vary as well. So the one that I did was quite short and relatively straightforward, but it involved running a bit on road to start off with, and then just running on tracks through fields, crossing stiles, running on the road again, and then down quite a steep section through some trees, over tree roots and stuff like that, and through fields. And yeah, so you get to do a bit of everything on a fell race.
I find that very challenging, thinking about routes and whatnot.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm kind of used to rough ground from doing cross country, which is also quite sort of up and undulating, and often things like tree roots and stuff, or steps even. Yeah, I think fell racing takes it up a notch in terms of the level of difficulty.
Right. What do you get from training and competing? I mean, it's definitely something that you prioritize.
I think for me, it's sort of motivation. It's that sense that you can always set yourself a new challenge. So it's not really about sort of other people as such. It's about the challenges that you set yourself, and that you can achieve different goals. And there are so many different kinds of goals. So even as you're getting older, you can, for example, you can set yourself a goal related to age grading, to try and run a time that's good for your age, basically. So that I find that really motivating. Or even these goals like doing certain types of races.
You mentioned goals a couple of times. I mean, are you very goal oriented in other parts of your life, or is sort of the sports where you put all that energy?
I like deadlines. I work best to a deadline.
Well, there's a goal. Yeah.
And my deadlines, one of the things that I do is I work for a business consultancy that writing competitive tenders, which for companies who are bidding for work, and that often involves writing so many words to a deadline. So I do quite like deadlines. But I think for me, running's really allowed me to bring out my competitive side and really sort of fully experience that. So that's what I love about racing, really. Just that chance to actually be competing is I find really satisfying.
And you didn't compete as a younger person, is that correct?
No, I've not really ever done much competitive sport. Just a little bit of swimming at school. That's about it. But no, I'm not being a competitive athlete in any sense.
Did you avoid it? I mean, like, how is it that you didn't find this part of yourself until more recently?
I think I didn't really feel that I had any talent at any individual sports. And although I enjoyed some team sports, I I didn't feel confident in team sport. And because it's a typical story for a lot of people, I think, because I was small and not particularly sporty, I always got picked last for things, for team games. So it was, I just didn't really have an outlet, I think, for that sort of competition. I mean, I sort of competed academically, I suppose, but not in sport. And the sort of activities that I've done have been individual activities. So I did Aikido for a long time, a Japanese martial art. I did lots of keep fit things and walking and those kind of things.
I always find that story so interesting because, I mean, I would say very clearly you are sporty.
Yeah, I think I'm fortunate in that I was brought up with access to the outdoors. We did lots of walking when I was a child, and I had lots of access to opportunities, and went swimming lessons, and I've always kept active sort of all through my adult life. But I just didn't really have that sort of opportunity or desire to compete, I think.
Do you think of yourself as an athlete now?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I do.
Good.
I started off sort of, first of all, you have to think of yourself as a runner, really. And I think quite a lot of people who run don't even think of themselves as runners. But then when I joined England Athletics, and I think, which I did through my club, and then I think when I started competing on the track particularly, and I got involved in Masters Athletics, I did really start to think of myself as an athlete. And Masters Athletics is a wonderful environment to be in, and you see so many inspiring people. It's really marvelous.
Do you do other kinds of training for your running at this point?
I've always done other things. So I did Iyengar yoga for quite a few years, and I've sort of stopped that for a bit because of the hamstring problem that I had. But I'm now going to a gym and doing small group training sessions twice a week, and starting to sort of lift weights, which I also find really motivating because you can always push yourself a bit harder and achieve more than you thought you could.
I'm impressed with the yoga. I keep trying to get a practice going and it just doesn't happen. And I've been doing yoga for a really long time. So anyway, it's a mystery because I do like it. Yeah, it's good. Well, let's talk about your book. Tell me about it and tell me about the research that you're doing.
Okay, so I started my blog, which is called Run Young 50, in 2014. And at first it was all about, my idea was to do an informal research project into women runners over 50, because I'd just turned 50 myself. And I felt that female runners didn't get as much attention, particularly older female runners. And so I started interviewing women and did a bit of analysis looking at the interviews. And then at the same time, I was listening to various podcasts, and one that I listened to really regularly called Marathon Talk had long interviews with athletes, and they included some female athletes from the sort of early days of women's marathon running. So, for example, they spoke to the British marathon runner Joyce Smith, and they spoke to Catherine Switzer. And it just started me getting interested in the history. And so I've been researching ever since. So I'm now writing a book about the history of women's distance running in the UK. And my reason for writing that is partly that I realised that the story of what happened in the States is much better known, but we really don't know that much about what was happening in the UK, and the stories of the women who were the pioneers in the UK.
One, I want to clarify that your book is not out yet. You're still researching and writing.
Yes, I'm. Yeah, I'm researching. I have a contract with a publisher, so the book's due to come out in 2026.
So you have a deadline.
Yes, I do. I do.
Well,
and
there you go.
It's not that far away.
Uh-oh. And then the other thing I started getting confusing when I was getting ready to talk to you was, so there's the history of women's running, and then the interest that you have in older women runners is separate from that.
Yes, it is. Yeah, they overlap a little bit along the
Right.
way, but yeah, it's a separate. That was kind of where I started with my blog, and then the history's overtaken it a bit.
Right. So tell me why you think that it's important to tell these stories.
I think it's really important because we know a lot more about the history from of men's athletics than we do of women's athletics, and I think that the stories from men's running history are much better known, and I just feel that I felt really that these stories need to be told now, or they need to be researched now, because women who were running, who were the sort of pioneers in the 60s, the 70s, the early 80s, obviously they're getting older, and some have already passed away. And if you want to capture those stories, that needs to happen now.
I'm going to push you on this because, I see this as important. I mean, like, I'm definitely part of your tribe. So
Yeah.
I just want to know more about, for like, what happens if you're not in this tribe? I mean, like, what is so important about knowing these stories and hearing these stories and capturing these stories and retaining them so that we know?
I think it's the foundations, really. If you look at running today, there are far more women running today than there were 40 years ago, but probably still not. There aren't as many women as men in races, in a lot of races. I think women today, we're not really aware of what the roots are, and people are often quite shocked when you say that women couldn't run the marathon in the Olympics until 1984. And in fact, the furthest they were running until 1984 in the Olympics was 1,500 meters. I think it's just really important that we understand, where we've come from. And sometimes there are resonances between the struggles that women were facing 40 or 50 years ago and the sort of struggles or the barriers that women are facing today.
Do you feel connected to those early runners?
I do, in the sense that they were running, I was alive then, I'm 61. So, by the time that the women's marathon got into the Olympics, I was 21, which means that I basically grew up, without really, seeing women running long distance. And, that shapes what you think that women can do. And so when I'm sort of reading, I'm doing a lot about the 1970s at the moment. And of course, I was a teenager in the 1970s. So it feels very real to me, reading about what was going on at the time. And, yeah.
I often find that knowing more about the history, like, for example, the 1984 example that you gave, that the marathon wasn't in the Olympics until then, it does explain sort of my perception of what sports is and what's possible.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And I also think that the development of women's running is very much linked to the social history and, women's position in society, basically.
Sure.
And generally, the history of women's sport has been somewhat neglected, and when sport history started as a sort of, people started to write sport history, and academics started to write sport history, it was tended to be totally focused on male stories. And I mean, that's changing now, but we need to know about the women's history as well, and avoid a situation where the prejudice of the time then leads to those stories not being told now.
So what are you finding, other than the 1984 example?
Oh, well, there's lots and lots
Sure.
to say. So it's kind of...
Is there anything that stands out that you're thinking about right now?
The focus of my book is on women who broke the rules. So really women who challenged their exclusion from men's races. And I suppose that one of the main things that you find out the more you look into it is that was happening rather a lot, and rather more than you might expect.
You mean women jumping into men's races was happening more than you expect?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. In different ways as well. I mean, a lot of people don't know about Dale Gregg, who was a Scottish runner from Paisley who ran the Isle of Wight Marathon in 1964. So that was 2 years before Bobby Gibb ran Boston, and 3 years before both Catherine Switzer and Bobby Gibb ran the Boston Marathon. So it was she was the starting point really for all of this research. And there were various different ways in which women broke the rules. And her way of breaking the rules was actually that the club allowed her to compete in the marathon. But they made her start 4 minutes ahead of the men so that they could claim that she wasn't really in the race. She was just doing a training run along the same route.
On the same day at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
That's hilarious.
But then they recorded her time, so we know what time she ran, and it got picked up by the press and it became a national story. And so that's kind of why we know about it. But often in other situations, women were sometimes just going along to men's races and maybe, just joining in at the back or something. But then when they got to the finish funnel, they would run off to the side. So, of course, what that means is that there's absolutely no record of them having done it. And the only way you tend to find out about those sorts of instances is either that a local newspaper picked it up, or, by interviewing the woman herself, and by interviewing people and asking them, did you do this?
Are you finding anything about those women who challenged the situation in the men's races that links them together, that, like they're something that's common about them?
I think really the common factor is that they all just wanted to see what they could do. And sometimes they wanted to do that in a race situation. So, for example, just to test themselves in a race situation, because you could go out and run 10 miles on the road, but that's not quite the same as being in a race. And what happened in the UK was that we ended up being quite behind what was happening in the States and in West Germany, in that we didn't actually allow women to run long distance until 1975, which was some time after the rules had changed in the States. And up till then, women were only allowed to run up to 6,000 meters, which is about 4 miles. And the rules were changed at the end of April 1975. But what that meant was that, that women just weren't getting the opportunity to run longer distances. And even after the rules changed, there still weren't very many races that would admit women. And that then led to a situation where women were going along to men's races and joining in unofficially because they actually wanted to get the practice at running those distances in a competitive situation.
It's still interesting to me that it even occurred to them that, like, hey, I want to see what I can do. I mean, no one else is running, basically. No other women are running. And yet it occurred to them that they wanted to see what they could do. I think it's fascinating.
Well, I think the other thing is that a lot of women did run somewhat long distance when they were training, even though they were, in cross country, they would only be running generally up to, most races were about 2.5 miles or even shorter. I mean, occasionally there might be a 4-mile race, but even just training for track and cross country, and track, they was either 1,500 meters or 3,000 meters in the 70s. In the early 70s, they were, they were still running a reasonable distance on either on the roads or off-road, as training. So they might well be doing a 10-mile run as training, but they just weren't allowed to race that distance.
Right. Oh, interesting. And were they training with men?
Some of them were, yeah. Often, I think when they were, especially women who were, most of the women that I've talked to so far were the top marathon runners of the time once they were allowed to run the marathon, and they were often training with men because they were fast enough to run with the men.
Did they know each other?
I think most women in athletics, so women who were competing, so they were good enough to run in the national cross-country championships, they knew each other because they raced against each other in cross-country races. But what we didn't really have in the UK was a unified campaign in the way that there was in the States. So in the States, after Bobby Gibb and Catherine Switzer ran the Boston Marathon in 1967, they then had women turning up every year until 1972 when they were officially admitted. So there was more than one woman turning up every year to run unofficially. So it was organised in that way. But in the UK, it was, as far as I know so far, it was more individual women taking action.
Interesting. So when you talk to these older women, you're interviewing them for the book and, to talk about what happened ages ago. Are you also asking them about their perspective looking back, sort of in, Monday morning quarterback kind of way?
Yes. I think, obviously when I'm interviewing them, they are talking from that perspective. And in some cases, I have interviews that they gave at the time. So it's interesting to ask them about their views now and how they felt at the time. Of course, it's quite difficult when you're asking someone to remember something from 50 years ago, and it sometimes leads to conversations where the facts are very clear in my mind, and I'm sort of very aware of what they were doing, what they said at the time, and they're actually, of course, trying to remember over that several decades.
Right.
Yeah.
Must be interesting conversations with them.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and the most interesting really is the questions that is not necessarily the answers to questions, but it's the extra information that they tell me and the things that I wouldn't have thought to ask them.
Oh, like what?
That they tell me that's really brings their stories alive.
Yeah, like what?
Like sort of, well, what did you feel like when you finished the race? And I had bloody blisters, and then telling me that the race was actually quite poorly, this particular race was actually quite poorly organised, and there weren't enough water stations, and it was a really hot day, and kind of, or a runner telling me about her experience of being assaulted when running, which was very dramatic, and
yeah, that's awesome. Awesome. Do any of them have, regret might be a stronger word than I want to use, but like sort of this wishing that they had opportunities that the current female athletes have now?
I haven't asked that question. And I think for some of the athletes, they ended up feeling they had a lot of opportunities because things opened up once you got into the 80s, and more opportunities to race came up. But Joyce Smith actually said in an interview, I think I was a little bit before my time. And she was Britain's top marathon runner in the the very end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. She won the first London Marathon and the second London Marathon, 1981 and 1982. But she was already in her 40s by then. And, she'll never know how good a marathon runner she could have been if she'd been able to start running long distance earlier. But it just wasn't, it wasn't available when she was in her 20s, or even until she was, well into her 30s. So, yeah, I think for some women there probably is that question mark as to what more could they have done if they'd had the opportunity. Because when women were first allowed to run long distance, of course there was no international competition then. That affected women in the States as well. There was no Olympics. There was no World Championships. They didn't start till 1983. In Europe, there was no women's marathon in the European Championships initially. So not until the 1980s, I think. So yeah, the opportunities weren't there in the way that they are now.
Yeah, I had a older woman tell me whenever she watches sports on TV, she always sort of points to the TV and says, that could have been me. And she's in her, I think she's in her late 70s at this point. So yeah.
Yeah, there were lots of women who never got the opportunities to race long distance, and we'll never know what they might have been able to achieve.
Right. What is your historical perspective on where we are right now in women's sports? I mean, there's increased audiences. I mean, I have so many questions about this. Anyway, why don't you go ahead and then we can get into it.
I still sort of thinking about my perspective on all of this, which I think will go into the conclusion in my book probably. But from a personal point of view, I just find it amazing how much things have changed. I grew up on a diet of men's sport. The only women's sport that I really saw on television was tennis. So I knew who Chris Evert was. I knew who Billie Jean King was. And then the Olympics, I suppose. The gymnasts, and that was really where you saw women doing sport. So for me, it's kind of amazing to see more women's sport on TV. And also in the UK, like recently I turned on the TV and there were 3 female commentators commenting on a men's rugby match, I think. And I just thought, to me, I just couldn't quite believe it, because I would never have thought that was possible. There were no women commentating on men's rugby when I was growing up. And so just, it might have been women's football, actually, men's football. But anyway, whichever sport it was a sport where I would never have expected to see, female commentators. So in some ways you think, wow, this is really great. But then in other ways, you're aware that, just talking about the UK, that, women's sport doesn't get as much coverage as men's sport. When I open my newspaper, there's hardly anything about women's sport. It's all men's football. men's cricket. And so there's still a long way to go. And women, in terms of in running, so specifically running, I think, women are still facing some of the same barriers to accessing some running events. And then if you think about intersectionality for women of colour or any people of colour, those barriers are compounded, and it's even harder to become part of some areas of the sport.
One of the things I keep thinking about is I talked to Natasha Cammey in a recent interview, and she is a ref, and she mentioned how excited she was about the growth of women's basketball. And she also said that she was feeling protective of the players, with the increased scrutiny. She was feeling protective of them being like over scrutinized or scrutinized for the wrong things, like their looks rather than their play. I mean, so that I think about a lot as well, is just sort of what is this increased audience doing? Is it a real audience, or is it still this sort of gendered, non-helpful audience, I guess? I mean, I think about NIL, for example, and, where the sponsorship money is going. And you mentioned that people of color are not getting that same kind of money. I mean, they're just, wow, we could talk a long time about all that.
Yeah, and I think some of, you can see these, sexist and misogynistic attitudes surfacing sometimes. Like some of those same attitudes that you might have seen in the 70s are still around, but it's nothing like it was in the 70s. But
yeah,
women are still kind of being given the message that their role is as wives and mothers and in the home and not in the public sphere, out playing sport. And it's nothing like it was then, but it's still, I think you can still see that sometimes in the way that women are portrayed in the media, or the sorts of questions that they're asked.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the percentage of media coverage, and we still are at 5%. So it seems kind of crazy. One of the things that excites me, though, is that more women are getting into ownership of teams and sponsorship deals. And that I find very exciting. I'm curious how that will end up.
Yeah, I sometimes think if I had, a limitless pot of cash, I would sponsor a women's cycling team so that we...
Yeah, me too. Yeah. We talked a little bit about, the importance of saving these stories. And again, I totally agree with you. But I do have this sense of sadness also about its need, and that it hasn't already been done. I mean, we're in 2024 and, it hasn't been done. And as you said, these women are getting very old. We have to do it now. I also have this general sadness about where we are in women's equality, obviously not just in sports, but everywhere. And, probably some of my thoughts are a result of the election that we just had here in the United States. But the US is not unique. And I also am seeing sexism in my own sport communities. And so it seems I'm excited about history, but I'm also sad about what it implies, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that some of the it sometimes feels as if we're fighting the same battles.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
And, it's like each new generation of women sort of has to recognize that for themselves, or has to recognize what those battles are, rather than there being a continuity, a sort of, I suppose, a feminist continuity of understanding what the dynamics really are.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the point of the history, so that it's written down and can be looked at again.
Yeah, it's understanding how the sort of power dynamics in society and the social position of women affected their ability to access running, and to some extent still does today.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking about it, limited to sort of the sphere of running, but all that stuff impacts the rest of your life. as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that we don't end on that downer, you've mentioned in past writing, and I think in your blogs as well, the importance of community for you. Talk a little bit more about that and maybe discovering community and what it brings you. And for me anyway, it's understanding and seeing that there are other people like me who are interested in sports and being physically active.
Yeah. And actually, that's one thing that's really great about podcasts like this one, is that it broadens your horizons actually beyond just your community of people that you see when you go out and do stuff, to, realize that, there's a much wider community of people who are interested in the same things. One of the things that I found when I was interviewing female runners for my sort of over 50s project was that a common theme was that the thing that really kept them running was community. So however competitive they were, whatever level they were at, it was the friends that they'd made and that sense of community that kept them running. And I think that's a really important thing in any sport. And it's certainly for me, that's been a wonderful thing about getting into running, is just having that feeling of being part of a wider community, a wider project, lots of people getting together to share the same thing. And I particularly enjoy Park Run for that, which is a Saturday morning run every Saturday at 9:00. It's just a free run that anyone can turn up to in a local park. And I've been doing that for 12 years. And I just love sort of turning up at my local park run and seeing people I know, and then also meeting new people and just doing my 5K. And doesn't matter if it's fast or slow. Sometimes I might want it to be faster, but it's more, and volunteering as well, which is a great way of feeling part of things.
I've never done a park run. I mean, I certainly know about it. Can you, describe it a little bit more? Like, what's it like, and how does it work?
So it started in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
and in the UK there are hundreds of park runs. So usually wherever you are, there'll be one that's not too far away. And basically you just have to register online and get a barcode. And then you can turn up at whichever local one you want to go to. And it's 9:00 every Saturday morning. And it's a 5K. So it's not a race, it's a run, or it's a walk. You can walk. I've walked them as well. You don't have to run them. And people just get together at the start, and we all get sent off on our way around the park. And then afterwards, you go through a finish funnel, you get a token. So you do actually get a time, and, you kind of know where you'll find out where you were, in the field. And often afterwards people might go for a coffee or something, and or you just have a chat with people. It's a really nice way to get together with people on a Saturday morning in a kind of then uncompetitive, kind of friendly community environment.
That's nice. There is one here in Cleveland. So anyway, I'll put information about that in the show notes. So thank you. Thank you. That's also a great way to end this podcast. Thank you so much. I love talking about history and older women athletes. It's awesome.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been really interesting for me too.
That was fabulous and such important stuff. Thank you, Katie. Find out more about Katie Holmes and her writing at runyoung50.co.uk. For more on running from Hear Her Sports, take a look at the running playlist on Spotify. Find that quickly from the playlist tab at hearhersports.com. And thank you for listening. Hear Her Sports is one of the very few podcasts that give female athletes and women in sport the time and the space to talk about what's important to them and about their sports. It's a perfect way to get to know the female athletes that you love and to meet new ones. As Katie said, community is so important, and for that reason, I appreciate all of you and all of my guests. See you in 2 weeks when we add another fantastic woman in sport to our community. Bye-bye.
Running should be simple. Just put on your shoes and go. And yet, when you try to learn about how to get better at it, especially as you age, you're confronted with conflicting advice, complicated workouts, and confusing nutrition trends that just won't work for you. On The Planted Runner, I'll share exactly how to run faster, longer, and feel great doing it at any age because you don't have time to waste. I'm Coach Claire Bartholic, and I went from not running at all in my late 30s to finishing a marathon in 2:58 at age 42, all on a plant-based diet. I've helped hundreds of runners achieve new personal records well into their 60s and even 70s with science-backed training, plant-based nutrition, and proven mental strength techniques. Each episode of The Planted Runner is like a private coaching session on the run where you'll learn from me and the guests I interview. You'll get actionable lessons to help you become a better runner every week and reach goals you never thought possible. Whether you're training for your first 5K or your 50th marathon, take along The Planted Runner on your next run. Let me show you how your best running is still ahead of you.